The storm outside was merciless, its fierce winds and torrential rain battering the small cottage that Emily called home. Inside, she paced nervously, listening to the chaotic symphony of nature's fury. Her mother, fragile and bedridden, slept fitfully in the next room, unaware of the tempest raging beyond the walls. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the night, startling Emily. Her heart raced as she rushed to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass, only to see a dark figure lying motionless near the front door. Without a second thought, Emily grabbed her coat and stepped out into the storm, the cold rain soaking her to the bone within seconds. She reached the stranger and knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked for signs of life. The man was unconscious, his clothes drenched, and his face pale as death. Straining with effort, Emily managed to drag him inside, the warmth of the cottage a stark contrast to the wild chaos outside. She laid him on the couch, her mind whirling with questions and fear. As she examined the stranger by the flickering light of a candle, a gasp escaped her lips. She recognized him, William Sinclair, the wealthy magnate whose face adorned the covers of magazines and newspapers. What could have brought someone like him to this remote part of the world, and in such a desperate state? Pushing aside her shock, Emily focused on tending to his wounds, her fingers deftly cleaning a deep cut on his forehead. Despite her fear, she knew she had to help him. Leaving him outside would have meant certain death. The hours dragged on as the storm continued its relentless assault, the walls of the cottage creaking under the strain. Emily sat vigil beside William, watching his chest rise and fall with each labored breath. Her thoughts were a jumble of concern for her mother and curiosity about the stranger who had stumbled into her life. Why was he here? And what kind of trouble had he found himself in? The questions gnawed at her, but there were no answers, only the unyielding storm and the fragile man before her. As dawn's first light crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the room, William stirred. Emily leaned in closer, her breath catching as his eyes fluttered open, disoriented and confused. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the dying wind outside. Emily offered a reassuring smile, though her heart still pounded in her chest. "You're safe," she replied softly. "I found you outside in the storm. You're in my home now." William's eyes widened slightly, but he was too weak to respond. For a moment, William seemed to struggle with his thoughts, his brow furrowing as if trying to remember something important. Then, with a resigned sigh, he closed his eyes again, too exhausted to continue. Emily watched him, torn between relief that he was alive and the growing unease that something much bigger was at play. She had never imagined that her quiet life would be disrupted in such a way. But now, with William Sinclair lying in her home, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. As the storm finally began to subside, leaving behind a world drenched and battered, Emily felt an inexplicable sense of anticipation. This was more than a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a journey that she had not chosen but could no longer avoid. Glancing at William, who had drifted back into a fitful sleep, she realized that she had no idea what lay ahead. But one thing was certain: this stranger, and the storm that had brought him to her doorstep, would change her life forever. The storm had passed, leaving behind a tranquil, almost eerie calm that settled over the small cottage. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. William Sinclair, now conscious but still weak, lay on the couch, his eyes following Emily as she moved about the room. Emily, ever the caretaker, busied herself with tending to her mother while also keeping an eye on her unexpected guest. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had taken an unexpected turn, one that she was not entirely prepared for. William, for his part, was quiet, observing the young woman who had saved his life. He was a man used to commanding attention, to being surrounded by luxury and power, yet here he was, in the humble home of a stranger who had shown him more kindness than he had known in years. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and discomfort, unsure of how to repay her for her generosity. As he lay there, he couldn't help but wonder what Emily's story was, what kind of life she led in this isolated place. As the day wore on, Emily found herself growing more curious about the man in her living room. She knew his name, of course. Everyone did. But the details of his life were a mystery to her. What she did know was that he was far from home, and that something had driven him out into the storm that night. She wanted to ask him, to understand what had brought him to her doorstep, but she hesitated, unsure if it was her place to pry. Instead, she kept her questions to herself, focusing on the immediate needs of her mother and her guest. William, sensing her reticence, decided to break the silence. His voice was still weak, but there was a firmness to it that commanded attention. "You must be wondering how I ended up here," he began, his eyes meeting hers. Emily paused, turning to face him, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "I won't lie, I am curious," she admitted, her tone gentle. William nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's a long story," he said, "and not one I'm proud of, but I owe you the truth." He began to tell her of the events that had led him to that fateful night, the pressures of his business, the strain on his marriage, the overwhelming need to escape, if only for a moment. Emily listened intently, her heart aching for the man who, despite his wealth and power, seemed so lost. She couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for him, seeing beyond the image of the powerful magnate to the vulnerable human being beneath. But even as she sympathized, a part of her remained cautious. There was still so much she didn't know. The hours slipped by as William talked, and by the time he finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light through the windows. Emily sat in silence, absorbing his words, trying to reconcile the image of the man she had always imagined with the one before her now. "I'm sorry for intruding on your life like this," William said quietly, breaking the silence. Emily shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. "You didn't intrude," she replied. "You needed help, and I was here. That's all." Despite her reassurances, Emily could feel a growing sense of unease. There was something about William's story that didn't quite add up, a lingering doubt that she couldn't ignore. But she pushed it aside, telling herself that it wasn't her place to question him further. He was a guest in her home, and she would treat him with the kindness and respect that she would offer to anyone in need. Still, the doubt lingered, a small seed of suspicion that she couldn't quite shake. As night fell once more, Emily prepared a simple meal, offering it to William with a shy smile. He accepted gratefully, his hunger evident as he ate. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl outside. But even in the calm, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that something was still unresolved. Emily couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring, what new revelations might come to light. And as she prepared for bed, her thoughts were a tangled web of worry and hope, fear and curiosity. The morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Emily had just finished preparing breakfast when the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached her ears. She glanced out the window and froze, her heart skipping a beat. A sleek, black limousine had pulled up outside the cottage, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, her movements sharp and purposeful. Even from a distance, Emily could sense the tension radiating from her. Emily barely had time to process the scene before the woman was at the door, knocking with a force that sent a jolt through the small house. "William," still weak but more alert than before, looked up in alarm. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. But Emily didn't have to answer. The door swung open, and the woman entered without waiting for an invitation. She was tall, impeccably dressed in designer clothes that seemed out of place in the modest surroundings, her eyes blazing with barely concealed fury. "William!" The name burst from her lips like an accusation as her gaze landed on him, reclining on the couch. Emily could only watch as the woman stormed across the room, her presence commanding and unyielding. "What on earth are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and relief. William struggled to sit up, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Margaret, he began, but she cut him off, turning her sharp gaze on Emily. "And who, may I ask, is this?" Margaret's voice dripped with suspicion as she glared at Emily, who instinctively took a step back. The warmth and safety of the cottage seemed to evaporate under the weight of Margaret's disdain. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. What could she possibly say to this woman who had suddenly appeared like a storm in her own right? Before she could find her voice, William spoke up, his tone firm despite his weakened state. "This is Emily. She saved my life last night," William explained, his eyes pleading with Margaret to understand. But Margaret's expression only darkened, her gaze flicking between William and Emily with growing suspicion. "Saved your life?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "And how exactly did that happen, William? What were you even doing here, in the middle of nowhere in the first place?" Her words were laced with accusation, and Emily felt the sting of them as if they were directed at her. William's explanation did little to soothe Margaret's anger. She seemed unconvinced by his account of the storm and his desperate need to escape the pressures of his life. Instead, her mind spun with darker possibilities, her imagination painting Emily as some sort of opportunistic vixen who had lured her husband into a trap. The idea was absurd, of course, but in the heat of the moment, fueled by fear and jealousy, it seemed all too plausible to Margaret. And so, her anger found an easy target in the innocent woman who had only wanted to help. The tension in the room was palpable, a thick cloud that seemed to suffocate any attempt at reason. Emily stood frozen, torn between the instinct to defend herself and the realization that nothing she said would likely matter. Margaret's fury was a force of nature, and it had swept through the cottage, leaving destruction in its wake. But as Emily watched the strained interaction between husband and wife, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow. Whatever had brought them to this point, it was clear that their relationship was hanging by a thread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret seemed to regain some semblance of control. She straightened, smoothing her clothes with a trembling hand, and turned to William with an air of icy detachment. "We're leaving," she said curtly, not bothering to mask the command in her voice. But William, to Emily's surprise, didn't immediately comply. Instead, he looked at Emily, his expression one of quiet determination. "I'm not going anywhere until I've properly thanked Emily," he replied, his voice steady. Margaret's eyes flashed with renewed anger, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned on her heel and strode to the door, her posture rigid with barely contained emotion. "Do as you please," she snapped over her shoulder, "but I'll be waiting in the car. Don't keep me waiting long, William." With that, she disappeared through the door, leaving behind an echo of her presence that lingered long after she had gone. The tension remained, though now it was tinged with something else, an unspoken understanding that things had changed irrevocably. As the sound of the limousine's engine drifted away, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. William, too, seemed to deflate, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with the unasked questions that hung between them. Finally, William broke the silence, his voice soft and filled with regret. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said, his eyes filled with an apology that went beyond words. Emily simply nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning of a much larger storm. The silence in the cottage was heavy, almost suffocating, as Margaret and William retreated to the small, dimly lit kitchen for a private conversation. Emily remained in the living room, her thoughts swirling with the echoes of the confrontation she had just witnessed. The tension between Margaret and William had been palpable, a thick fog of unresolved issues that seemed to fill every corner of the room. As she sat quietly, Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, though she knew she was not to blame for their troubles. In the kitchen, Margaret's voice was low but sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "How could you, William?" she began, her tone laced with pain and accusation. "How could you run off like that, without a word? Do you have any idea what I went through when I realized you were gone?" Her words were heavy with the weight of years of unspoken fears and doubts. William remained silent for a moment, his head bowed as if carrying the burden of his own regret. When he finally spoke, his voice was tinged with exhaustion. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said, his words sincere but weary. "I didn't mean to scare you. I needed to get away, to clear my head. Everything has been so overwhelming lately. The business, our marriage. I felt like I was suffocating." His admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Margaret's expression softened slightly, but her anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. "And you thought running away would solve everything?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you even think about how I would feel?" William met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, they truly looked at each other, seeing not just the person they had married, but the wounds they had inflicted on one another over the years. "I wasn't thinking, Margaret. I didn't know what else to do," William confessed, his voice breaking with the weight of his own emotions. "I've been so focused on everything else, trying to keep it all together, that I didn't realize how much I was losing in the process. How much I was losing you." The words struck Margaret deeply, stirring emotions she had buried long ago. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together, even when it felt like her world was falling apart. But hearing William's admission, his vulnerability, she felt a crack in the walls she had built around her heart. "I was scared, William," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of losing you, of losing us. I know we've been distant, but I didn't know how to reach you anymore." In the next room, Emily could hear the muffled voices, the raw emotion seeping through the walls. She tried to block it out, focusing on her mother, who slept peacefully despite the turmoil unfolding nearby. But Emily couldn't escape the feeling that she was intruding on something deeply personal, something that had been brewing long before she had found William on her doorstep. It wasn't just a fight between a husband and wife. It was a battle with their past, with the wounds they had inflicted on each other over years of neglect and silence. As the conversation in the kitchen continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about the events of the previous night. It was about years of unresolved pain, of missed opportunities for understanding and connection. Margaret spoke of the loneliness she had felt, even while living under the same roof as William, and how she had tried to fill the void with distractions that never truly satisfied. William, in turn, acknowledged how he had buried himself in his work, convincing himself that he was doing it for them, even as he drifted further away. Emily listened, her heart aching for the couple who seemed so lost, yet so desperate to find their way back to each other. She knew she should leave, give them the privacy they needed, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was her own longing for connection, her own struggles with the idea of love and the fear of losing those she cared about. Whatever it was, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Not when it felt like something important was happening, something that could change everything. The conversation between Margaret and William finally began to wind down, the anger and hurt giving way to a fragile truce. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, but there was a sense that both of them wanted to try to rebuild what they had lost. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling as she took William's in hers. "I don't want to lose you, William," she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "But we can't keep going like this. We need to find a way back to each other before it's too late." William squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "I know," he replied softly. "I want that too, Margaret, more than anything." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken emotions. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start, a fragile beginning to something that might just heal the wounds of the past. As they sat there, holding hands across the table, Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek, unnoticed and unbidden. She quickly wiped it away, hoping that this was the turning point they so desperately needed. As the uneasy truce between Margaret and William settled over the cottage, the atmosphere remained thick with tension. Emily could feel it, a palpable undercurrent that made every interaction feel like walking on thin ice. Margaret's suspicion of her hadn't completely dissipated, and although she tried to maintain a facade of civility, the mistrust was evident in the way she watched Emily's every move. William, caught in the middle, was torn between his loyalty to his wife and the gratitude he felt toward Emily for saving his life. Margaret, unable to shake the nagging doubts in her mind, began to probe for more information. "So, Emily," she started one evening as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, "how exactly did you come to find my husband? It's not every day that a man like William ends up in a place like this." Her tone was polite, almost too polite, but the question was loaded with suspicion. Emily, sensing the underlying accusation, chose her words carefully. "I heard a noise outside during the storm," she explained, her voice steady. "When I went to check, I found him unconscious near the door." Margaret nodded, but her eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for any hint of deceit. "And you just took him in? No questions asked?" she pressed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Emily felt a flicker of irritation, but kept her composure. "He was hurt, Mrs. Sinclair. I couldn't just leave him out there," she replied calmly, meeting Margaret's gaze. "I did what anyone would have done." But Margaret wasn't satisfied with that answer. To her, it seemed too convenient, too simple, and the nagging suspicion that there was more to the story continued to gnaw at her. The tension between the two women grew, casting a shadow over the cottage. William, sensing the growing rift, tried to diffuse the situation. "Margaret, Emily has been nothing but kind to us," he said gently, placing a hand on his wife's arm. "We owe her a great deal." But Margaret's pride and fear wouldn't allow her to let go of her doubts so easily. "I'm not questioning her kindness, William," she replied, her voice strained. I need to understand how you ended up here in the first place. Why were you out in that storm? What were you running from?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. William hesitated, his eyes flicking to Emily before returning to his wife. He knew that this was the moment of truth, the moment when he would have to confront the reality of what had driven him away that night. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak, his voice quiet but steady. "I wasn't running from anything, Margaret," he said, his words measured. "I was running from myself, from the life I've built, the life that's been suffocating me. I needed to get away, to clear my head, to think." His confession hit Margaret like a blow, her breath catching in her throat. She had always known that things weren't perfect between them, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the depth of William's despair, was almost too much to bear. "So, you just left," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You left me. You left everything, without a word?" William's eyes filled with regret as he nodded. "I didn't know what else to do," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I felt like I was drowning, Margaret. I didn't see any other way." As the truth spilled out, Margaret's anger began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. She had been so consumed by her own fears and insecurities that she hadn't seen how much William was struggling. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Why didn't you let me in, William? We could have faced this together." William shook his head, his own eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I was afraid, Margaret, afraid of what it would mean, afraid that it was too late for us." The raw honesty of the moment left both of them vulnerable, their emotions laid bare. Emily, feeling like an intruder in their private pain, quietly excused herself, retreating to her mother's room. But even as she tried to give them space, she couldn't escape the feeling that something significant had shifted. The truth, painful as it was, had finally been spoken, and with it came the possibility of healing. But healing would not come easily, not when so much had been left unsaid for so long. As the night deepened, Margaret and William remained in the living room, their hands clasped tightly together, as if afraid to let go. The storm outside had long since passed, but the storm within them was only beginning to calm. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there were no easy answers, but for the first time in a long while, they were facing it together. And in that moment, as the truth hung between them like a fragile bridge, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the cottage, but the tension inside was far from dissipated. Margaret had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind replaying William's confession over and over. She had known something was wrong for a long time, but hearing it from his lips had been like ripping open an old wound. She rose early, her thoughts heavy with unresolved emotions, and found herself standing at the window, staring out at the peaceful landscape that seemed so at odds with the turmoil in her heart. William, too, had spent a restless night, plagued by the guilt of how far they had drifted apart. He knew he had been wrong to leave without a word, wrong to let things fester for so long without addressing the growing chasm between them. As he joined Margaret in the kitchen, he saw the weariness etched on her face, the sadness in her eyes, and it broke his heart. "Margaret," he began softly, his voice filled with regret, "I'm sorry. I should have never let it get this far." Margaret turned to face him, her expression a mix of hurt and determination. "It's not just you, William," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I've been holding on so tightly, trying to control everything, that I didn't see how much I was pushing you away. We've both made mistakes." There was a moment of silence as they stood there, the weight of their shared past pressing down on them. It was a moment of reckoning, one that had been a long time coming. The silence was broken by the sound of the door opening, and Emily appeared, her face pale and tense. "William," she said urgently, her voice trembling, "your mother. She's taken a turn for the worse." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. Without hesitation, William rushed to his mother's side, Margaret following close behind. The elderly woman lay in bed, her breathing shallow, her face a pale shadow of its former self. William's heart clenched as he took her hand, feeling the coldness of her skin. Margaret watched as William whispered soothing words to his mother, his voice breaking with emotion. She had always admired his strength, his ability to remain composed in the face of adversity, but now she saw the vulnerability beneath that strength, the fear of losing the person who had been a constant in his life. As she stood there, watching the man she loved grapple with the reality of his mother's declining health, something inside her shifted. The anger, the jealousy, the suspicion, they all began to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of empathy and understanding. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible as she reached out to place a hand on William's shoulder. "I didn't realize. I didn't see how much you were hurting." William looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. "We've been through so much," he said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I don't want to lose you, Margaret. I don't want to lose us." The words, simple yet powerful, hung in the air, a plea for forgiveness and a promise of renewal. Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pulled William into a tight embrace. "We'll get through this," she whispered fiercely. "Together." It was a promise, not just to him, but to herself as well. A promise to let go of the past, to stop holding on to the things that had driven them apart, and to start rebuilding what they had lost. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be many challenges ahead, but in that moment, she knew they had taken the first step toward healing. As the day wore on, William and Margaret sat together by his mother's bedside, their hands intertwined, offering each other silent support. Emily watched from a distance, her heart heavy with her own emotions. She had been a witness to their pain, their struggle, and now, their tentative reconciliation. It was a bittersweet moment, one that reminded her of the fragility of life and the importance of holding on to the people who mattered most. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the connection she had with her own mother, even as she faced the reality of their uncertain future. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the cottage, William's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep. It was a moment of profound sadness, but also one of peace. William and Margaret held each other close, drawing strength from their shared grief, and in that moment, they knew they had been given a second chance. A chance to rebuild, to heal, and to find their way back to each other. It was a moment of clarity, a moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection, as William and Margaret took the time to mourn and to reconnect. There were still many things left unsaid, many wounds that needed to be healed, but they had found their way back to each other, and that was what mattered most. And as they stood together, watching the sun rise on a new day, they knew that they had been given a gift, the gift of time, of love, and of the chance to start again. The days following William's mother's passing were filled with a quiet kind of healing, the kind that comes from shared grief and newfound understanding. Margaret and William moved through the cottage like two people rediscovering their place in the world, their relationship, and most importantly, each other. The tension that had once dominated the air between them had softened, replaced by a tender resolve to mend what had been broken. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to walk it together. Emily watched this transformation from the periphery, her role in their lives shifting from the caretaker of William's wounds to a silent observer of their healing hearts. She found solace in the knowledge that she had played a part, however small, in their journey back to one another. Her mother's condition had stabilized, for which she was grateful, and though the future still held uncertainty, Emily felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in a long time. The cottage, once filled with tension and unspoken fears, now hummed with a quiet hope. One afternoon, as the three of them sat in the living room, William turned to Emily with a look of gratitude that brought a lump to her throat. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You saved my life, And in a way, you saved our marriage too. We could never repay you for that." Margaret nodded in agreement, her eyes softening as she looked at Emily. "You've given us a second chance, and that's something we'll always be grateful for," she added. Emily, uncomfortable with the praise, simply shook her head. "I didn't do anything that anyone else wouldn't have done," she replied modestly, though her heart swelled with the acknowledgement. "I'm just glad that you both found your way back to each other." But William wasn't satisfied with that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a check, placing it gently in Emily's hands. "Please take this," he insisted. "It's a small token of our appreciation. Use it to take care of your mother, or for anything else you might need." Emily looked down at the check, the amount staggering, but she quickly pushed it back toward William. "I can't accept this," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "I didn't help you for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do." William and Margaret exchanged a glance, both moved by her selflessness. But they could see the strain in her eyes, the quiet desperation that came from years of struggling to care for her mother on her own. Margaret, ever perceptive, leaned forward and gently took Emily's hand. "If not for yourself, then for your mother," Margaret said softly. "Let us help you, the way you helped us. It's the least we can do." Emily hesitated, her pride warring with the practical need that gnawed at her. Finally, with a deep breath, she nodded, accepting their help not as charity, but as a gift freely given by those who understood the true value of compassion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you can ever know." In the days that followed, the cottage became a place of quiet reflection and planning. William and Margaret began discussing their future, making plans to return to the city, but with a renewed focus on their relationship and the things that truly mattered. They spoke of taking time away from the business, of finding a balance that had been missing for so long. For the first time in years, they felt a sense of hope, a belief that they could rebuild their lives together, stronger and more connected than ever before. As for Emily, she began to think about her own future, about what she wanted for herself and for her mother. The gift from William and Margaret had lifted a burden from her shoulders, allowing her to focus on what truly mattered, caring for her mother and finding a way to create a life that wasn't solely defined by hardship and sacrifice. She started to dream again, to think of possibilities that had seemed out of reach before. And with those dreams came a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. On the day William and Margaret prepared to leave, the three of them stood together on the front porch, the sun shining down on them, casting long shadows on the ground. There was a sense of closure in the air, but also a sense of new beginnings. "We'll stay in touch," Margaret promised, her eyes bright with the possibilities of the future. William nodded in agreement, his expression one of quiet resolve. "And if you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out," he added, his voice full of sincerity. As they drove away, Emily watched them go, a mixture of sadness and hope swelling in her chest. She knew that their lives would never be the same, that the experiences they had shared had changed them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. But she also knew that they were stronger for it, more resilient, and more connected to the things that truly mattered. And as she turned to go back inside, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that whatever the future held, she was ready to face it with an open heart. As the days passed and the echoes of recent events began to fade, the cottage settled into a peaceful rhythm. Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had transpired, the storm that had brought William to her doorstep, the tension and misunderstandings that had nearly torn him and Margaret apart, and the quiet moments of reconciliation that had followed. It was as if the storm had not only cleared the skies, but had also swept away the barriers that had kept them all isolated in their own struggles. In its wake, it left a profound sense of clarity and understanding. For Margaret, the experience had been a revelation. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to manage any situation with grace and determination. But the events of the past few days had shown her that true strength lay not in control but in vulnerability, in the willingness to let down her guard and truly connect with those she loved. The realization that she had nearly lost William, not to another person but to the distance she had allowed to grow between them, was a sobering one. But it had also given her the resolve to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of trust and open communication. William, too, had undergone a transformation. The near-death experience, the raw honesty with Margaret, and the quiet compassion he had found in Emily had all served to remind him of what truly mattered in life. For too long, he had been consumed by the demands of his career, losing sight of the simple joys and the people who mattered most. But now, with his mother's passing and the emotional upheaval that followed, he found himself yearning for a life of greater meaning. A life where success was measured not by wealth or power, but by the depth of his relationships and the love he gave and received. Emily, perhaps the most changed of all, felt a deep sense of fulfillment that went beyond the immediate challenges she faced. She had always seen herself as someone who simply got by, who did what needed to be done without expecting anything in return. But through her interactions with William and Margaret, she had come to understand the impact one person's kindness can have on others. Her selfless actions had not only saved a life, but had also played a role in mending a fractured marriage. It was a humbling realization, one that filled her with a quiet pride and a renewed sense of purpose. As she reflected on these changes, Emily couldn't help but think about the power of understanding, how it had the ability to bridge even the widest of divides, to heal wounds that seemed beyond repair. Margaret and William had found their way back to each other not through grand gestures or easy solutions, but through the simple act of listening, of truly seeing each other's pain and fears. And in doing so, they had discovered a path forward, one that was built on empathy, forgiveness, and the willingness to change. The lessons of those days stayed with Emily, shaping the way she approached her own life. She realized that understanding wasn't just about knowing someone's story. It was about being willing to walk alongside them, to share in their struggles and joys, and to offer support without judgment. It was a lesson she carried with her as she cared for her mother, as she planned for their future, and as she thought about the kind of life she wanted to build. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Margaret and William, now back in the city, found that their renewed commitment to each other extended beyond their relationship. They began to apply the same principles of understanding and communication to their work, their friendships, and even their interactions with strangers. The changes were subtle at first, but they grew over time, creating a ripple effect that touched every aspect of their lives. They were still the same people, but with a deeper sense of purpose and a clearer understanding of what really mattered. The power of understanding had not only transformed their lives, but had also brought them closer to the people around them. Margaret, once guarded and distant, found herself opening up to others, sharing her experiences and offering support in ways she never had before. William, once driven solely by ambition, discovered the joy of slowing down, of truly engaging with the world around him. They were happier, more fulfilled, and more connected to each other and to the life they were building together. As Emily stood on the porch of the cottage, watching the sun set on another day, she felt a deep sense of peace. The journey they had all been on was far from over, but the lessons they had learned would guide them as they moved forward. She knew that life would continue to present challenges, that there would be moments of doubt and fear, but she also knew that with understanding, anything was possible. It was a lesson she would carry with her always, a reminder that no matter how difficult things might seem, there was always a way forward, if only one was willing to listen, to understand, and to love. as you reflect on Emily's journey and the powerful message of understanding that brought healing and renewal to all their lives. Remember that we all have the ability to change the course of our relationships through empathy, compassion, and a willingness to listen. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how understanding has impacted your own life. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and activate notifications so you never miss an update. There's so much more to explore, and we'd love for you to join us on the next adventure. And if you feel moved to support our work, check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment. Every little bit helps us bring you more stories like this one each day. Thank you for being part of our community. Together, let's continue to embrace the power of understanding, one story at a time.